All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to the Finance Careers with a PhD Insights by Industry Experts panel by Futures. I am Desmond Cole, a PhD student here at the School of Medicine and a Futures Fellow. I will be the moderator for today's session. I am thrilled to introduce our two distinguished panelists, Dr. Hayone Maiz and Dr. Divya Rao. Dr. Hayone Maiz is a principal at Anzu Partners, where she invests in companies at the intersection of life science and innovation technology. She also supports portfolio companies in business development, strategy, and product development. Hayone received her PhD in neurobiology from UCLA and has an MBA from Quantic. She also has a bachelor's degree from Northwestern University and is presently a Kaufman Fellow. Prior to Anzu, Hayone was a director of business development at Zymergen, supporting life science and healthcare partnerships with Fortune 500 companies. Before Zymergen, Hayone supported new drug discovery company formation, development, and partnership at Inception Sciences, an incubator within venture fund Versant Ventures. Dr. Divya Rao is an equity research associate at TD Cowen, where she evaluates private companies based on their science and investment potential. She received her PhD in chemical and biomolecular engineering from Johns Hopkins University, where she focused on developing novel non-viral gene therapies for the treatment of brain diseases. During her graduate training, she interned at Catalio Capital Management as an analyst in their venture arm. She vetted private companies and evaluated a company based on their science and investment potential. She also holds an undergraduate degree in chemical and biomolecular engineering from North Carolina State University. For today's session, the first 30 minutes will be for moderated questions for the panel, and the last 30 minutes will be open for the audience to interact and ask questions for our panelists. We are very fortunate to have such accomplished and insightful panelists with us today, and I'm excited to hear their perspectives on what it takes to succeed in the fast-paced and challenging industry of venture capital. All right, so Hayone and Divya, can you take us back to when you were beginning to contemplate your next steps? What career paths were you exploring? And I guess I could start this with Hayone.
Sure, yeah, happy to. So I started down the pre-med route in undergrad and thought I wanted to be a doctor. And then I decided I wanted to do research. I went and did a PhD. And mostly, halfway through my PhD, realized, I'm not really interested in being a professor, which kind of at the time was the only thing you do with a PhD. So one of the cool things, we looked around and said, there's so much innovation happening. Professors are innovating within their labs. There's a tech transfer office that's kind of doing something. It wasn't clear what or how much. That's probably changed, and that's probably different at Hopkins today or places like Stanford, right? But back at UCLA in the day. And there was this cool thing that was kind of incubating called the business of science. And it was this concept of, place like UCLA, you've got MBA students, engineering students, MD students, PhD students. Like, what if we all come together? What if we form these diligence teams? What if we learn about the innovation that these professors are doing? How can we help triage those ideas, see whether there might be a market or not, see whether it's worthwhile to stand up a startup company or not, support that effort at tech transfer. And professors really liked that because it was sort of somebody else. Oh, is there a question? No? Oh, just anyhow. So I really enjoyed that. It seemed to do something valuable. And so I thought to myself that I wanted to learn all of the different aspects that it would take so that I could help be that person, right? To help triage innovations, to decide whether they were, meaningful and commercializable, and then help commercialize them, get them out of the universities or out of the founders' minds and into a real product that could help somebody eventually. So kind of focused on medical innovation. So with that was, that decision helped me kind of look and say, okay, well, now I either go and get an MBA right away, right? And I'd gone straight from undergrad to grad, and people were like, stop going to school for a minute, right? Like go get some experience. And so I thought, how cool would it be, like, if I could get finance experience or investment experience, or like there was like a list of things that I thought would be interesting skills to become this person that could help, triage and commercialize. And so I just kind of started applying. And we can talk later about how much of it is luck or not. But it was a little bit of let's throw some spaghetti and let's see what happens. So I'll pause there and let Divya share her experience.
Thanks, Aaron. And thanks to Desmond and the team for Teachers for having us on. So I guess I have been out of school not for very long, so I feel like this is I was in your shoes probably not too long ago. But I'd say like, I kind of did the same thing. I started with the pre-med route, decided, okay, maybe this isn't for me, want to do research, ended up getting a PhD. And like by the end of my PhD, I realized that really the only type of job I knew was an option was to do R&D at like industry or to become an academic. And I realized that I didn't really see myself doing lab research anymore. And I actually was, talking to my PI, and he was the one who recommended, oh, why don't you, talk to Catalio, see, because I had told him I want to do something where I can talk about science and give people ideas, but not physically have to do any of it myself. And so he put me in touch with Catalio. So for the year that I was there, we did we heard from a lot of private companies, and, tried to kind of look at it from like a preclinical perspective to then extrapolate out, okay, do you think that this company could actually go public, make a product that will be successful, and then eventually get commercialized and make revenue? So there's a lot of like obviously factors that go into that, but I realized I didn't really understand the public market, what that takes, what investors care about. And also I didn't really know how to value a company based on any kind of financial metrics. And so I looked at, types of careers that would potentially help me do that. And so at the time I was looking at both consulting, and I got introduced to equity research through like literally just cold emailing people about equity research. And so I ended up finding this position at Cowen, and I've been here for, I guess, coming up on 2 years now. So I cover, publicly traded biotech companies and understand the landscape, what investors are interested in, what people actually care about. So that was kind of the trajectory of, types of careers I was considering. That's all I'll there.
That's awesome. So what I'm hearing is that I guess what underpins both of your experiences is sort of like an awareness of, okay, what I'm currently doing is what I want to do forever. What else is out there? So being resourceful and seeing like what opportunities exist, and then sort of like looking and seeing like what the next step is to actually reach what your goals are at that time, and also recognizing that things can change and you have to pivot and so on and so forth as you learn more. So that's great. And so I'm curious to know, I guess with that, did you have a particular strategy, or I guess could you go more in depth in terms of like what was your exact strategy for entering the job market? And I guess more like information on your career trajectory and how you ended up in this current position. And I'll start with Hayone again.
Sure, yeah. Divya, amazing experience. So I didn't have the experience Divya did. So when I told folks that I probably didn't want to do a postdoc, I didn't get very nice, responses. I got sort of like, oh God, you're going to the dark side, blah, blah, right? Again, I think that's probably different now at places like Hopkins, and maybe elsewhere, but there was a bit of sort of insiders versus outsiders of academia. So that said, like there's so much crosstalk between industry and academia now that I would recommend what Divya did, right? Like talk to everybody and see who has connections to who, like, why not? And so I had a postdoc offer. I put it on hold for a year, and I thought, okay, I've got savings for a year-ish, and I've got a little bit of a support network. If I need it, like I'm gonna go see what's out there and like what I can do. Did a bunch of like little things, consulting kind of for free almost. And then the biggest thing that I learned is kind of like, forget the no's, right? Just, I was cold emailing, I was cold offering. I was just like, anything was fair game that I thought was interesting or engaging on. I was helping like an entrepreneur that I met, like launch his thing, just kind of hustling. And I don't know if that's the right word, but just kind of, rolling on my sleeves and like doing whatever. And then I just got over the no's. I got so many no's and so many like non-responses that by the end of it, I was just like, yeah, whatever. Like, of course I'm going to reach out to so-and-so for like an informational interview, because what's the worst that can happen? They're not going to respond. Like, I got that, right? So it's a weird place to kind of get to. mentally, but I think it's positive for the resilience factor. And so recommend, if you think something is interesting, I think one of the trickiest parts that I found that Divya reminded me of is sometimes that you want something called equity analyst, and sometimes you don't even know what that is, right? You're just like, I don't know what that title is, or I like these things. I want to do this kind of science or this kind of business, but I don't know what that's called. Read job descriptions, right? Talk to people, informational interviews, like reach out on LinkedIn. Like you never know who's going to bite. You never know what that person's going to be able to tell you about the next three, it's sort of this bifurcation that goes on endlessly. You never know who you're going to meet along the way that could be, insightful or a mentor. So I did that for a year, right? And like I said, I kind of reached out coldly to, ironically, Silicon Valley Bank, and got my first job there. It was doing company valuations, actually, Divya. So I was doing something called 409A valuations, which is private company stock valuing. So similar to the public markets where, public companies stock is available based on market demand. The private companies don't have that market. And so we were offering services to help value companies and private stock options. And it was a great place to be. In that case, they wanted or were interested in somebody like me who had the science background and could help them understand the companies that they were working with and investing in. And I was very transparent up front. I was like, I don't know anything about a balance sheet. I don't know anything about financials. Like, I'm super excited to learn. I really, here's my motivation to learn. I'm ready to dig in. And from their perspective, they're like, great, you have a PhD. Like if tomorrow, if your expertise is X and tomorrow you want to learn Y, you guys know how to do that, right? Like you go and read the papers, you find the experts, you know how to ask good questions, you know how to look at data. Like finance is so much easier than that, right? So it's something that you could pick up if you wanted to, or something that you could learn. And I would recommend, I know we're going a little bit all over the place, but I would recommend learning a little bit about it, even if it's not interesting to you. And you could do that through Coursera's and things, which I did. It's useful to be able to talk the talk a little bit. So whether it's like a structured format that you learn about these things, or whether it's like a job experience, or whether it's, sitting down with somebody who knows about this or whatever, but being able to have some sense of kind of some of those metrics in the landscape. So that kicked off kind of the, once I was in the bank, it was okay, great. Like I get finance, I can do evaluation, right? I can blah, blah, blah. Like what else, right? Oh, I really like the companies that we're working with, right? I really like these startups, right? And instead of a bank's approach, which is invest in 10 of them and all 10 competitors are fine because the bank can make money on that, I was keen to say, yeah, but which one's the best one, right? How do we know which one's the best one? Like, I want to pick the best one. I want that experience. And so that's what took me to venture after that, because that's the venture model. So I'll pause there. Hopefully I answered your question, Desmond.
That's awesome. And I also really appreciate you highlighting how your skill set and everything that you worked so hard on in your PhD was able to be utilized for your current position. Divya, could you?
Yeah, can I make one more comment on that? Just to double click. This is something that wasn't intuitive to me at the time. And what's helpful is lean on the people around you, like your family, your friends, if your PI is useful, if your colleagues, whoever you collaborated with, like when you are feeling like, oh God, I only know this thing, right? And I know this a lot. And like, how is that transferable to anything else? It is wildly transferable. Like you can learn anything, you can analyze anything. You have like thoughtful, like there's tons of skills. It's just really hard to see how they translate. Phone a friend, like whatever the lifeline, expression is. And when you do that, they'll say like, oh my God, you are brilliant in ABC. And by the way, you have emotional intelligence and blah, blah, blah. And like, here are all these factors that like build a really interesting person for industry in a bunch of different ways, right? Not just a super expert in whatever your PhD topic is. I'm not sure if I'm explaining myself well, but hopefully that's coming through, right? That you sometimes need somebody else to tell you what you're good at, and I would definitely lean in on that.
Yes, thank you. No, we appreciate that incredible insight. Divya, do you want to, I guess, chime in on this?
Yeah, I want to 100% echo everything Anya said. Like, I think I would say for me, it was like hitting that point of being willing to cold email people and cold call people and expecting a no, but sometimes they're going to say yes. And like the ones that say yes are the ones that are super insightful, want to talk to you, want to be like helpful. And you have to remember that one, people love talking about themselves, absolutely love it. Like you can get someone to talk about themselves forever. And so I think you should really, like, people should really lean into that. And like on LinkedIn, just be like, hey, I looked through your like career path and I really thought this was really cool. And so I'm like looking to gain more experience or learn more about X role that you have. Just like a few tips on the cold emailing thing that I learned like through my kind of journey of finding my job is that one, like maybe don't contact the senior vice president of the company that you want to work for. That's probably less helpful and probably not going to give you what you want. But you should email someone who's like maybe just entered or maybe a year or two in, who's still kind of new, still willing to talk to you. And I think you get a lot of insights from that. And two, like use your network. So like Hopkins has a giant network, and just like reach out to someone who also went to Hopkins, and like you have that connection, people are more willing to help you. Like that's just like a huge thing. So those are just like a little like few points about LinkedIn. But the way I got my job, so I did the Catalia thing, and I realized like I really love this. Like I really loved this job. It was just like one of the coolest things I've ever done. In like 6 months, I learned about everything from like life science diagnostics to vagus nerve stimulation to CAR T cells, and like my PhD was in gene therapy. So like I just felt like you could learn so much. And when I was like kind of exploring like what other options there were, that's what I did. I just like emailed people and I was like, hey, I want to learn more about your venture firm. I want to learn more about your equity firm, whatever it is. And actually, like the way I ended up getting my job was that I had a friend whose friend worked at 5 a.m. Ventures, and then she knew someone that worked at Cowen like 6 years ago, who knew someone who currently worked at Cowen, who like then flagged my resume when I sent in my resume through like the giant portal. Like it's all about like someone who can help you find someone else who can help you find someone else. And just like kind of the last thing, like one of the things that one of the women told me that like kind of stuck with me was that like every time you do an informational interview, see if you can get one more person's contact information and then use that and like keep going. Because one, you'll learn so much. You learn so much about what to do, what not to do. Like the guy who I've never still met, like this guy that got me my job, I've still never met him in person. And he like, sat with me on the phone, like he like helped me, figure out what my pitch needs to be, what I need to talk about. Like for equity, I didn't even know I needed to do a pitch until I talked to him, and like, all of that stuff. Like I think it can be a little daunting to just like cold email people, especially coming out of a PhD where you feel like you know a lot about one very specific subject. But I think there's a lot of skills, kind of also what Hannah was saying, like there's a lot of skills that are very translatable, and you need to like really kind of dig into that, figure out like you can present your research to both like scientific audiences and general audiences. You can like literally think of like, okay, here's a problem and here's all the ways I'm going to solve this problem. And you can read a paper very quickly. You can be like, this is the paper, this is what I need to find in this paper. And if it's not useful, it's not useful, within like a few minutes. And honestly, that's a skill that not everybody has. So I think those are all things that when you're coming out of a PhD is really helpful. And then when you're trying to like be put in touch with other people to potentially find jobs, like networking is the biggest thing. Because if you just send your resume into the big pool of stuff, most likely it's not going to get flagged. And you want your resume to be flagged. You want to have that option.
Awesome, thank you. You both are extremely insightful. You've answered a big chunk of questions I was planning to ask you already. So I do have another question though. So can you walk us through a typical week in your current role? And what is your favorite and what is your least favorite aspect of it? Sorry, and I'll start with Haley.
I guess. Okay.
Or Divya, either way.
Go for it, Divya.
Yeah, so there honestly is no typical day in my job, and I'm sure Hannah feels the same way. Every day is very different, just like a PhD. Every day you're like, oh, this is my goal for today, and like it'll be derailed in the first like 20 minutes. So just to like give a brief overview, so I help my analyst I have two bosses, and I help co-cover about 20 publicly traded biotech companies. And what that means is I have to know what is going on in the company, what are the clinical programs, what are the competitor programs, and eventually, like the goal of this job is to give stock recommendations for our clients who are investors. So like hedge funds, mutual funds, whoever they are. And the way we value a company is based on all the clinical programs that they have. We have to look at, okay, based on the way this clinical program is, the mechanism, what other people have done in the past, potential side effects, uptake in the market. We essentially make a market analysis, and we look at in 20, 30 years, or maybe 20 years, I think that's more reasonable. In 20 years, like what is the revenue potential of this product? And we kind of compile all of that and do a DCF analysis to figure out essentially what is the value of the company today based on what it could generate in 15, 20 years. And that is like your target stock price. And so obviously if a company is trading below that stock price, it's a buy. And if it's not, then it's not a buy, or, you know, not necessarily a sell, but it might not be a buy. And so that's the goal. So I guess like net with that, my typical day is very hard to explain, but I'll tell you like all the different things that we do. So news typically comes out between like 7:30 and 9 Eastern time. And so you pretty much have to be awake to see if there are any news from your specific companies that you cover that might affect their strategic goals. And so that usually happens between 7 and 9. And once that press release hits your inbox, you have to read through what it is, how you think it's going to affect the company. Do you think it's negative? Do you think it's positive? Is it incrementally positive? How positive, like, you know, you have to evaluate to what extent this press release or this news affects this company. And we usually publish a note that says exactly that, what we think is going to happen, what we think is the eventual problem or good thing about it, and then what the actual news was. So that's usually done by around 11. And then between 11 and 4, when the market closes again, we do all of the long-term work that talent is known for. So we do a lot of these white papers that talk about the landscape. We put out these like therapeutic reports that kind of go through like literally everything being evaluated in the landscape. We vet companies that are looking to potentially go public. We, you know, talk to physicians. Say I have a company that is, you know, just launched commercially. So then we like, you know, talk to physicians and say, okay, are you actually prescribing this? Why would you not prescribe this? What would you prefer to prescribe over prescribing this? Have you had any issues with Medicare or with insurance? You know, all of that stuff. So that's usually what we do between kind of like 11 and 4. And then on top of all of that, you also, it's a client-facing industry. So clients will just randomly call you and be like, hey, what is your peak sales number for this drug and this indication? And you're like, let me tell you. So, you know, it's a client-facing environment. You have client calls, you have client emails. That's just kind of scattered throughout the day. And then when the market closes at 4, again, there's a deluge of press releases, not just for your own companies, but could be for any companies in the space. And then you kind of do the same thing that you did in the morning, in the evening. So the days are pretty long. They like start at 7 and on a good day end at 7. On bad days kind of can go later, but that's just like a very general overview of what we do. And yeah, I'm happy to like give any more specifics if anyone has any more insights, but I assure her is very different from mine.
Thank you. Yeah, Iona, can you tell us about your day today?
Sure. Well, this is a nice way to start it. So I'm on the West Coast. So I'm in venture capital, which is a little bit different than what Divya is doing. So we're working with early stage life science companies, typically like seed, Series A. So it's usually like the first or second kind of round of financing. The companies are usually anywhere from like 5 to 50 people, let's say, kind of in that range, mostly scientific founders. And these are like platform technologies. So they might be things that could evolve into an instrument or a research tool, reagents, kits to do some experiment, diagnostics, things like that, things that enable drug discovery, next generation, anything that's biomanufacturing. So that's kind of our sweet spot. So we do two things-ish on a given day. One is, well, many, but so one of the things we do is screen new companies for investment. So we'll have, a handful of pitches a week. Each pitch will be, 30 to 60 minutes, where the company will tell us about their new technology and kind of the investment opportunity. And then if we think it could be a good fit, if we're interested, then that usually leads to like a second call. Sometimes that leads to like a data room or, basically a virtual, like a Dropbox or box where the company will put like a bunch of their technology updates and patent filings and, corporate information, financial estimates, right? And we'll dig through all of that. So some combination of like screening new companies, diligencing, what we call diligencing new companies, which is digging in to figure out if there's a there for us. And then the second kind of thing that we do is support the companies that are already in our portfolio. So these are companies we've already invested in. And again, because they're kind of earlier stage science companies, we support with things that are not core to the technology. So typically it's things like accounting or finance or HR and recruiting, like, helping them fill out their team. In my case, I jump in to help with company strategy and business development. So if they're, hoping to negotiate a collaboration with a pharma or looking to, update, sales pitches or kind of sales infrastructure. A lot of it's like early stage kind of commercial infrastructure as the company is getting ready to sell their products. So I've been helping with those kinds of things. So my day and my week is a combination of all of that. And then what Divya said, kind of like inbounds from like, can you provide, or can you look at, or, so-and-so's friend is starting a company, or, LinkedIn people being like, do you guys do internships? We do, right? So, or different ways of engaging with the community. I'm really keen to help founders that may not be on, the mainstream venture capital's radars. So, always kind of looking for nooks and crannies of really good work through publications, through networking of folks that are working on cool things. But, yeah, so that's kind of and then when there is time, which is not very much of after all of this, but doing what Divya said, also kind of thinking about like, what do we think, the landscape looks like for a certain kind of technology, or, who are the new competitors for this kind of company that we're interested in? What do we think the market potential is of some of these new industries? Where do we think the trends are going, right? Like, what is generative AI going to look like for healthcare? Whatever, like things that are happening in the news where you're kind of like, wait a minute, like, is this going to affect us, or how proactive or not do we want to be in this? So yeah, I'd say that's kind of the day and the week there.
Thank you. That sounds great. So now I want to open the floor to the audience to ask questions and interact with our panelists. So I guess starting off here, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourself. In the meantime, I do have additional questions. So I'm curious to know from both of you, what skills are you able to learn or sharpen within your current role in comparison to your previous role as PhD students? And I'll start with Divya.
That's a good question. So honestly, I think some of the biggest things that I've had the opportunity to learn in this job versus being in academia is, one, like the breadth of knowledge that you have to be comfortable talking about. And even if you're maybe not a specialist in that area, but just being able to have a conversation, being able to engage with people, I think that's, very important. I think that's something that's maybe underutilized in academia is just like just having, being able to have a conversation about different types of topics, different fields, different indications, different specialties. And I think the other thing, which I kind of alluded to before, but when I started this job, I knew nothing about finance at all. I had like a personal portfolio that I would maybe like dabble in some investing and mostly lost a lot of money. But that was kind of the only experience that I had. And so I had to spend a ton of time the first like year that I was at my job learning all of those things. How do I make a market model? How do I build a DCF? How do I look at a balance sheet? How do I read a cash flow? How do I read some of the SEC filings that these companies have? I think those are skills that I'm still developing, but I think those are kind of like the two biggest skills that I've had to learn kind of very quickly that I maybe didn't have when I was in academia.
Okay. And what about you, Hannah?
Yeah, I have two thoughts on this. The first one is that my experience in academia, the more you can do as an individual scientist, the better, right? Like if you can write the entire damn paper by yourself, like, and you get all the credit, like that is, at least used to be more valued than like, here's a paper with 20 people because they all contributed some expertise, right? And then as a postdoc, it seems to be similar, like you are incentivized to kind of do as much as you can on your own. And really that stops outside of academia, right? Like any new, if you want to start up a startup, right? Like if you're going to do it by yourself, it's going to be really hard and very unlikely to succeed, right? Kind of on the data. Like the best thing you can do is work as a team effectively. So find, what are your strengths? Find other people that have other strengths and then collaborate with those strengths. Or if you work in a big company, you're going to have to work with a team, right? And so that switch I see is a little bit tricky sometimes for folks coming out of academia. So it's something I would just be cognizant of, and I would lean into like, figuring out where you want help and like how you want help and where you can help others, right? And then kind of realizing that the team is going to make the company successful. It's not going to be the individual anymore, right? So that mindset is totally different. The other skills I would say that I'm learning now that are different than academia is like communication is a big one. So in science, we tend to kind of like, here's my intro, here's my methods, here's a bunch of stuff, and then like, oh, bottom, is the conclusion. Like in business and in your companies that you go to next, like the conclusion's the first thing, right? And this took me years to figure out, but like executive summary is a real thing, and like summarize totally like everything you want to say, like what is the actual takeaway, right? The top of your slide is no longer like, methods. It is like, advanced whatever, like we improved the methods by 4x, blah, 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 right? Like it's those kinds of takeaways. And those are like, those little shifts make such a difference for talking with your bosses. As Divya said, it's unlikely to have a boss. We have bosses, like lots of stakeholders that want lots of information, especially if you are a subject matter expert of something in your team. So I would think about communication, be very deliberate about that, and look around and see what else are people doing that makes sense. Try to kind of focus yourself to the conclusions. And then there's going to be a bunch of soft skills that are like really intangible and hard to measure, but like think about your PhD and like all the favors that you asked for, right? All the like collaboration things, like all the times that you needed to borrow something and nobody wanted to give it to you, or the times that you needed money and nobody wanted to, buy you the whatever. All of that's going to be super useful, right? I don't mean in a negative way. I mean it like positively. Like, how do you actually work with people? How do you influence people that you don't have hierarchy over, that you don't have explicit power over? How do you guys work together in a way that is win-win? So I think those are some of the things that, the objective stuff you have already. You can do the science, you can talk the science. You're gonna have to learn to talk the science. I mean, we all do, right? We have to learn how to talk about the science in a way that somebody who knows nothing about science has to, right? In many of our jobs. Some of you will have jobs that some people understand, right? Like some versions of medical writing, but again, kind of the crisper, the cleaner, the kind of more explicit the takeaway, I think the better off you will be. Divya, say something if you disagree, but I think that.
No, I agree. I think the communication piece is something that I'm still learning. I think that you have to learn to communicate with lots of different types of people in very different ways. And I think that you just need to be adaptable to that. I think, you know, in my 6 years, I talked to literally like my 2 PIs, and that was pretty much it, right? Like in terms of, this is the issues that I had, this is the progress that I've been making. It was just like really addressing one person. And then at the very end, it was just my committee. But when you get into the corporate world, especially in finance, there's just so many different types of people to communicate with. Like, people also respond in different ways. Like, some people like to just like see little bullet points of like what the takeaways are. Some people like to see more of like a PowerPoint. Some people just like to be told verbally. Like, you just have to be very adaptable in your communication style. But yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. 100%.
Yeah, I think the phrase for that type of communication is putting the bottom line up front and just like really having, you know, what is it like, what are we getting out of this thing that you're going to spend an hour talking about?
And by the way, I do that in emails too, right? And it's not that you ignore the details. Like Divya said, lots of people want details. So you say take away here, and then you say for more details, please read below. And then you do all that. It's the too long didn't read, right? Of the Twitterverse here. That, yeah.
Awesome. So we have some questions popping up in the chat now. Jiali asked, is internship experience necessary? If so, how did you find the internship?
I would say no. It was a nice to have for me to
I
get
agree.
in.
I don't think it's necessary.
Yeah. And
I think you just mostly need to show that you have interest in the field that you're going into. You know, if you're trying to go into investments, like going into a mutual fund or something, show that you're interested in investing and like what you've done to further that experience or interest. You don't need it doesn't necessarily need to be like a very specific or structured internship, but just like showing that you are interested or have experience, even if it's like personally, on whatever job that you're trying to look for, I think is sufficient.
And on the flip side, I think as you're exploring different things, it can be helpful if you want to start rejecting things, right? Like, oh, I think I'm interested in blank. And then you try it and you're like, oh God, no. Like, I want nothing to do with this, right? Or I don't like this aspect of it, and you keep refining. So if it's possible to do one, maybe, but it's not, I don't think it's necessary, yeah.
Awesome. And do you have advice for those that are interested in finding internships? I'm assuming things like leveraging LinkedIn is very helpful.
LinkedIn networks, I think it's back to the same kind of answer, right? Of Google's aggressive Google searching will be your friend for so many things. We offer internships if it's not the right kind of fit technology wise or stage wise or whatever. We can try to reach out to folks, but there's more and more kind of fellowship programs. I think if it's not called an internship, it might be a VC fellowship. Early stage, I would talk to like the technology transfer office at Hopkins and like any other kind of business of science and endeavor, the MBA students, right? There's kind of through those channels, there's probably folks that know about some opportunities and can at least get you connected.
Yeah, I guess like more Hopkins specific too. I would like, for at least for me, I definitely took part in all of the features like seminars, and I did the resume help, but through I think the professional development office at the JHMI campus and through features, I think there are like summer internship opportunities. There's like I think like visits to certain areas. There's like weeks. There's like I think I remember one being like just like for the month of January, like an internship. So I think that's another way to go about it if you want a slightly more structured way to break into the industry.
Yeah, I also wouldn't discount like an internship at the tech transfer office itself, right? Like it doesn't have to be anything like fancy or crazy. Like it could just be, hey, so-and-so professor is launching a company, like I'll help with, what does that look like, right? Depending on what you want to learn, people might, welcome the help in random ways that are not kind of, here's a job description posted, right?
Awesome. We have another question by Janavi, and I'll pose this for Divya first. The question is, were there any soft skills that you acquired during your PhD that help in your current role?
Thanks. I mean, I think we kind of touched on them briefly, but like being able to present your research, I think is, you're going to be presenting either you're selling a stock, like you're like, hey, this is a good stock, you should pitch it. Like there's always a way to try to convince people or try to get people to listen to you. So I think those are some of the things, like I would say, like being able to present your research. And then the other thing is like when people pose questions or people poke holes, to be able to not get incredibly defensive and say like, hey, okay, I acknowledge this point of view, this is what I thought of, but I acknowledge that there's other ways to think about it, and maybe I'll look into that in the future. So I would say like that. I would say that's like kind of the biggest skill I took away. The other thing, we kind of talked about it, but like if you want to stay in the life sciences, being able to read papers, being able to evaluate companies, I think those are all like understanding if a certain mechanism works for a certain indication. I think all of those things are soft skills that you don't necessarily point out when you're going through a PhD, but like are actually very useful. And then I think the last thing would be the problem solving aspect of it. Like your entire PhD is essentially solving a very, very specific problem. And every day, I feel like, at least during my PhD, I felt like every day there was a new problem. A new experiment would fail, new assay would look weird, like whatever it was. And so I think being able to problem solve and figure out, okay, what do I need to do to solve this problem? Are there multiple angles that I can do, that I can utilize to solve this problem? I think all of those skills are very useful, and especially when you move out of academia and go into industry. It doesn't necessarily have to be finance, but just really any industry.
And Harona, do you have thoughts on this?
I think I everything Divya said. Another thing that comes to mind is, in science, like if you're doing journal clubs or in general, if you are looking at somebody else's work, there's a tendency to kind of like look for the holes and look for the problems and then kind of attack those, right? And go in. I would try to reframe those as ways to be productive, right? So like it's good that you can identify those kind of cracks in the foundation or those superficial problems, but rather than attacking, like how do you make it constructive? And so learning how to, and you can practice that in your PhD, in the journal clubs and in these situations today, right? And notice like, who are the problem people who are just like, well, this is terrible, or this is a problem, versus trying to be more curious about it. Like, well, why did you do it that way? Like, what was the assumption, or what, how do we jointly kind of figure this out? Or how do I offer something that might be helpful versus an attack? That seems like a soft skill that some people kind of do better than others, and is more useful when you're working on teams.
I really like that, having a more positive and constructive spin on critique as opposed to just being quite negative. So Joseph Choi asked the question, do you have any advice on breaking into the sector / most valuable ways to connecting to people outside of cold emailing? And I guess, Harona, do you have any thoughts on this?
We touched on a few of them, right? Like look around and see who might know somebody and ask questions. There's, I know it's hard, right? Because you're like, wow, I'm this like expert in this and I don't know anything about that. And it's a weird feeling, but I think humbleness and kind of curiosity and just asking questions like, hey, so-and-so professor that's already launched a company before, like, what was that experience like? Like, what would you do differently this time? Like, hey, tech transfer office, like, what do you wish you had more of, right? Or what are some of the challenges that you've run into? Or like whatever, if you think you're interested in some aspect of it, I would just kind of start asking some questions, talk to people. Hey, like Divya said, right, would you be willing to make an introduction to so-and-so? Or asking people on LinkedIn. if you're trying to reach some like professor, like you can always read their stuff, or even some of the biotech companies lately, like they'll publish publications and white papers like, hey, I read these 2 papers and like, wow, right? Like this is really interesting. I have some questions. Can you spare 20 minutes, right? If you are like, if you're in the mindset of, oh gosh, this first person said no or didn't respond and I'm a failure, like you got to get that out of your head, right? And it's just like, changing industries once is really hard. Changing like, but it'll happen, and you just got to keep going. And back when I looked back, like when I first started, I've changed careers a couple of times at this point. When I first started, I was like, this is impossible. Like, how is this going to happen? Right? There's no pathway for this. There's no playbook. There's nobody that like has done this. It looked like, right? It's hard to tell at the time. You're like, how? And just one foot in front of the other, right? Just one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one curiosity at a time, one, it's not this, it's that. Like, oh, actually from this, I really like that, right? And just kind of keep going. And then if you feel lost, turn around and look at your friends and your family and like, hey, remind me what I'm good at. Like, and they're like, wow, you're really good at this. And you're like, wow, I guess I am. Like, what can I do with that, right? Or refresh kind of your mental state. So sorry, I didn't mean to take that kind of negative, but I think a lot of people struggle with that kind of headspace as you're exploring or jumping into a brand new, set of companies or tools or yeah.
Desmond, am I allowed to talk? I just noticed everyone was just typing.
Oh yes, of course. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I guess like to elaborate on that. Like I've done the cold emailing, I have like done some work at the tech transfer office, but I think just when jumping to kind of applying for more formal opportunities, like at the like NPM has some, or like APC, I haven't gotten any useful feedback, I think, kind of on anything else in terms of what they're looking for. So I think for me, it's just like, I don't really know if there's anything I'm missing in terms of like making those valuable connections and so on. Like I've talked to alum from the programs, right? And like, made those connections. So at this point, it's like, is it just a matter of time, or, is like, are they looking for kind of like more experience on like the VC side, for which I think is kind of a struggle for most people in grad school, just because I don't find like, super specific experiences that exist, like at least immediately to me.
Yeah, it's a frustrating like chicken and egg, right? What I found, well, so first of all, I'm happy to talk offline if you want. And like what Divya mentioned that she was able to do with somebody, like we can walk through how you're describing your pitch, like how the story is coming across, right? Any maybe there's resume tweaks we could do or whatever. I think what I found is, I heard that, oh my gosh, I used to hear like, we want a PhD, MBA, MD, like JD with, 2 years of experience, and we're going to call you an associate at this venture firm. And I was like, what? Like, that's insane, right? Like, that makes no sense. And I found a ton of those, and I was just like, great, not a good fit. And then finally, this bank called me back that I cold called, like, and you're just like, what? They want me for what? Like, I don't know anything about this, right? And so it's like matchmaking, right? You just gotta kiss a lot of frogs, and keep going. I think is part of it. It's not the best advice, but I'm offering help separately, and we can try to connect you offline if that's helpful at all. But it's frustrating, but stay with it.
All right, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Ross also asked the question, does it matter at all what you actually studied during your PhD, or just that you did your PhD in something? And I think you guys might have touched on this a little bit, but if you could elaborate.
So it depends on what you want to do. If you want to be like, at Roche Genentech doing, your PhD really like gene therapy, right? Then it matters. If it's like, startup, whatever, or VC, whatever, that like is agnostic across, or maybe equity analyst, right? Where you're like looking at a bunch of different kinds of technologies, like, then it just goes back to like, can you talk and understand science? Can you analyze data? Can you understand what's valuable or not? Like, what is a good milestone? What is a value inflection point in the research, right? Divya?
Yeah, and to expand on that, no, I totally agree. Like, I think I don't think it has to be like you know, I did my PhD in gene therapy, but I don't cover only gene therapy companies. But like, I do think it's important to do something in life science if you're going to a life science VC or you're covering biotech companies. It is good to just like be able to have a conversation, you know, to know what a T cell is, to know what an inflammatory response is, you know, things like that. Like, I think makes the job a little bit easier. It's not to say it's not hard to learn, or it's not possible to learn it. It just makes the job a little bit easier. So, so I would say like a PhD, like, you know, maybe a math PhD isn't ideally suited for a job covering biotech companies, but that's not to say it's not possible.
Yeah, and I think, you know, from my perspective, since we're kind of more in the sort of tech plus bio intersection, like I've started getting into cybersecurity stuff recently, and I've done a couple of deals in like cybersecurity. One of them is kind of life science related, but like, yeah, I don't know about that, but like I can dig in, I can, you know, interview experts, I can ask questions, I can like, you know, understand problems, I can talk to customers, right? Going back to the soft skills, like can you just talk to people? Can you ask questions? You know, get the information that you need to start formulating your kind of thoughts. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Hunter, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, and sorry, I had to step out in the middle of this, so I apologize if you guys already went over this. But for Ione, what was the process of choosing to get your MBA? And do you feel like that, I guess, how did that impact your career trajectory? And Divya, like, do you think you'll need to go back and get an MBA? Or are you good with just the PhD? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll answer that quickly. So I thought I needed it coming out of my PhD, and then got the advice that, you know, just go learn. I actually got the MBA during the pandemic. It was kind of a little pandemic project. So I did an executive MBA all online. And I highlighted the name for this biography because it's pretty inexpensive and pretty accessible. It's like very easy to do. And what I realized doing the courses there is that I knew most of it just through work experience at this point, right? Like there was some ways to measure supply chain logistics that I didn't know. So there's some math, right? Like, fine. So at this point it was the title for me, to be totally candid. And then, you know, back in the day, what I did do right out of my PhD is I found kind of a crash course MBA. This one was at Stanford Business School, but it was like a month-long intensive program. And that was more helpful because it was like, here's the vocab. Like, you're not going to learn business in a month, but like, here's how people in marketing talk about marketing. And like, here's at what point in your startup, you need to find somebody that looks like this that can talk about the following things. And you're like, great, right? So that was helpful. A lot of that stuff is available online now and for not too expensive. So I wouldn't necessarily go the Stanford route, but those kinds I would explore. Maybe there's something at Hopkins or nearby. Those kinds of things I thought was useful. It wasn't about the topics or the vocabulary or the actual like expertise. At that point, it was my confidence to be able to address some of those things and to talk about some of those things with other people who I deemed were experts, right? I was so intimidated by it that it was like oh, you got this, right? Like it's just a handful of like things that are already happening that you're already kind of aware of. You just didn't look at it through that framework because you were busy doing experiments in the lab, right? Hopefully that answers your question, Hunter, but.
Yeah, that's super helpful.
Yeah, and Hunter, to follow up on the second part of your question, I am not sure I need to go back and get an MBA. Most of the people that are kind of in equity or, you know, have moved into hedge funds, like I think don't have one. And I think a lot of times, like the MBA, like I was saying, it's like it's the vocabulary, it's the connections, it's those things, but those are things that you can also learn kind of elsewhere. And so I still plan to go back and get an MBA, and I'm hoping that I can learn the skills that I would have learned if I, you know, went to go to back to school just by doing the job.
Cool.
I'll add a couple more notes about MBAs actually, that it's harder to go back to like, if you want, let's see. So the MBA that I did, for example, was content, right? It wasn't a focus on anything else. the MBAs that you might do at Hopkins, or pick your favorite top name university, a lot of the value seems to come from the network that you built there, right? The people in your class. If you are keen to jumpstart into one of these careers that we're talking about, an MBA could be the right answer today. It's very expensive, but like the recruiting access that you have, right, for some of these jobs is very extensive on some of these campuses. So it's also very hard once you've been working for a while to then take 2 years off and pay what that costs and take that time off, right? I say that because there's an opportunity cost to the salary loss that you're taking, right? So there's kind of a couple of different factors. So later in your career, I think it becomes something like, if you want to do a dramatic change, or if if you're trying to access a specific kind of title or a specific kind of track, right? If you want to be a chief commercial officer, or if you want to be a whatever, that's one thing I might kind of think about earlier versus later, if that's what you're thinking about, like the kind of standard, proper MBAs on campus.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. So we are getting close to the hour. So I want to thank you both for your time and your expertise, and thank you for all who participated and engaged. We wish you all the best in your journeys. And I do want to ask Hayone and Divya, is it okay if people have remaining questions if they reach out to you after the session?
Of course.
Awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. There's I think both of our emails are in our name. So
yes. Okay, perfect. Awesome. All right. Thank you all so much, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. All the best.
thank you.
Bye-bye.